What's up, smart students? Welcome to The Smart Student. My name is Chelsea Seaburn, and this is video number 2 in the mini-series where we're covering Harvard referencing style. Now, first things first, I have a downloadable free PDF template of everything I'm going to cover in this video, where we are officially transitioning to the topic of reference list entries. And now this topic is so important that I am breaking it down into 2 parts. This is the first video, so I highly recommend watching this first before you watch the other one, because what we're going to start with is the basic building blocks, the foundation of a Harvard reference list entry. We're going to cover all the different formatting principles for the different scenarios of reference list entries. Then, once you have that knowledge, in the next video, we're going to go through actual reference list examples, building them together. Sounds like an aggressively good time if I do say so myself. Go ahead and download that PDF, and I will see you guys in my laptop. Woohoo! Here we are. Okay. So this is the document that we're going to go through, but there's a little information we need to cover first. And that is, well, let's start at the beginning. What is the purpose of a reference list entry? Why do we have to do it? They're complicated. We'd rather not, but here we are. So the reason you need to know how to create reference list entries is that you're writing academic papers. And what that means is that you're writing research-based papers. So that requires you to go outside and research other sources. You need to go survey the current state of information on a topic, the knowledge that's out there. In other words, ideas, thoughts, pictures, whatever that other people came up with first. That information is what you're analyzing, paraphrasing, or directly quoting and putting in your paper. And so in order to do that, you need to credit the original author, the original source that it came from. Why? Well, because if you don't, that's considered academic theft, aka plagiarism, aka you're missing points on your paper, which you do not want. And now it's very important to note that whether your plagiarism is intentional or unintentional, it doesn't matter. When your professors grade your papers, they run it through a plagiarism checker. And so if a percentage comes back that your paper is plagiarized, their hands are tied. They have to count you off, whether it's intentional or unintentional. So just keep that in mind. Next, when it comes to Harvard referencing, or any referencing for that matter, a full reference is made up of 2 parts. You have the reference list entry and the in-text citation. So looking at this document, this is spoilers for the next video, by the way. This is the template you'll get if you watch that video. But I just want to show you the 2 components. So you have the full reference list entry, which we're covering right now, and then you have the corresponding in-text citation that would be located in your paper. What's the relationship here? Well, it's like this. So we already know that you're paraphrasing or directly quoting information from another source, and you need to credit them. In your paper, to signify that something is coming from another source, you're going to include an in-text citation. This lets the reader know that, okay, this information comes from somewhere else. What that in-text citation does is it links that material to the full reference list entry at the end of your paper, in which you could go look up the original source. So I like to say they all link each other together. In-text citation in the paper to the full reference list at the end of your paper to the original source. Checks all your bases. No one's getting plagiarized. There's no academic theft. You're good to go. So coming back over to the reference list entry, this is what we're going to focus on now. The first thing you need to understand is the 4 elements that make up a reference list entry. You have the author, the date, the title, and the source. In other words, when you're creating a citation, these are the 4 things you're looking for. They're not always going to be present, but this is the aim, the end goal that you're shooting for. So author, who is responsible for this work? Who wrote it? Who recorded it? Who drew it? Whatever the case may be that's relative to that piece of work, who is responsible for its creation? Now the date, this refers to the publication date. And the way I like to teach students is, when did this piece of work become a citable source? So if it's a book, when was it published? If it is a YouTube video, when was it posted? So on and so forth. Moving on to the 3rd element, which is going to be the title. Well, what is the name of the work you're trying to cite? So if it's a journal article, what's the name of that article? Easy. And then finally, the fourth element, you have the source. Now, the source element is the most important of the four elements because, quite frankly, you have to have a source element in order for it to be a citable source. You can be missing the first three, but as long as you have a source, it is citable. And the reverse is true. You could have all the first three, but if you don't have a source, it's not a citable source. And so that's exactly what it is. It's where that source is located. I like to tell students that an easy way to think of this is, well, where did you find that source? That's probably a good place someone else would have to look as well. And so now we're going to go through this document, which what we're going to do is break down each of these elements and cover the different scenarios in respects to formatting. Why? Well, because creating Harvard reference list entries is about doing two things. One, finding those four elements and putting it into the correct formatting pattern depending on the scenario. So let's zoom in. Here we go. First thing I want you to note about the author element is that, well, there's two categories. You have authors, and then you have a group author. The difference here is that an author is when a person or people are responsible for the work. If it's a group author, that simply means it's not a person or people. It's something like a government agency or an institution, maybe a university, maybe it's a corporation. It's a group author. But let's go ahead and start with one author. So anytime you have a person, doesn't matter if it's 1, 3, 5, 20, the way you're going to format each individual author is like this. You're going to include their name inverted, simply meaning that their last name comes first, followed by a comma, and then their first initial with a period. Okay, that's all you need. So let's take that principle and let's look at two authors. You're going to format each author the same way, except now we're going to separate the two with the word and. So as you can see here, we have last name, followed by a comma, first initial, period, the word and then same thing. Last name here was John, we have our comma, and then our first initial with the period. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. It's the same thing, except when we have three or more authors, now you need to use a comma to separate the authors. However, I want you to take note that after the last two, you're not going to put the Oxford comma, meaning you're not going to have a comma between the second to last element and the last element. You're going to keep it just as the two are, and that there's no comma separating them. So all authors follow the traditional formatting for each author, and then the last two continue with the same principle for two authors, and that it's separated by the word and. Now, something else I would like to note about an author is that you want to include their name the way you found it. So if they have a two-part surname, you would go ahead and include that second surname. So let's say this last one, Hornbrook, had a surname, and that was Smith. So Hornbrook Smith. Note how there's no hyphen. Why? Well, let's say the source I'm trying to cite, if there's no hyphen between these surnames, I'm not going to include it. If there is a hyphen, well, then I'm going to include it. So just keep that in mind, and that you want to keep the author's name how you found it. And then same thing with a group author. For the reference list entry, you're going to type out the full group. You're not going to abbreviate in the reference list entry, so there's no confusion on what you're citing. You can, however, use abbreviations in the in-text citations. However, that'll be explained with examples in that video. And since we're in the realm of in-text citations, there's something I want to address when it comes to reference list entry that I find students get confused a lot with an in-text citation formatting principle, and that is when you have three or more authors, you're asked to use the abbreviation et al. In your in-text citation. So for this one, it would be diets et al., meaning and others. However, for the reference list entry, you're never going to use that abbreviation et al. And the reason being is because you want your reference list entry to correctly reflect the source you're trying to cite. So rule of thumb, leave all abbreviations for in-text citations. But that leads us to the second element, which is going to be the date. And the date is very simple. You need to include the year of publication. If there is no date, well, it looks just like that. No date is going to equal no date. For Harvard, you're not going to abbreviate n.d. like you'll see in other reference list entries. I found that most of them type out no date, lowercase letters like you see it is there. But we're officially 2 for 2. We have the title and the source element next, or last, shall I say, and I'm actually going to discuss them side by side because there's something really important to note about these two elements. And so these two are going to be formatted based on what type of source it is. And so there's two categories that all sources fall into, and that is a work that stands alone or a work that is part of a greater whole. If you've never heard of this before, I'm about to simplify it for you, so don't worry. This is the same principle for APA formatting, by the way. This is actually from APA formatting, but it's the same thing for Harvard. And so a standalone source simply means that the work is considered whole or complete on its own, where part of a greater whole is exactly what it sounds like. It's a portion of a standalone source. So my best example is I want you to think about a book versus a book chapter, a journal versus an individual journal article. That journal article is part of a greater whole, that greater whole being the journal. So here is a source formatting chart, just so you can see. You don't need to memorize what each source is and whether it's a standalone or a greater whole. Rather, I want you to take note that most are standalone sources. And if you're ever unsure, you just need to ask yourself, is this source considered complete on its own, or does it belong to something else? And now one note I will make, because this does confuse students, is that web pages fall under the standalone category. Sometimes students will think, well, a web page belongs to a website, so shouldn't it be part of a greater whole? No, each individual web page stands on its own because you're never going to cite just a website typically. Each web page is independent in that it's its own source. So coming back over here, now that you know that, let's talk about the title in specific. And so we can see our two categories here. What I want to do is start by zooming out and covering the formatting principles for titles, no matter whether it's a standalone or a greater whole. So first, I want you to take note that the title element is written in sentence case. This means that the first letter of the first word is capitalized. And so if there is a main title and a subtitle, you're going to capitalize the first letter of the first word for both of those. And that leads me into the second formatting principle, and that is that if you do have a subtitle, you're always going to include it. And the way you're going to format it in the title element is you're going to separate them with a colon like you see it is here. And then finally, if your title has any irregular punctuation, you're going to leave it as is. So in this example, the subtitle ends with a question mark, so we're going to leave that question mark in our title element. However, if there is no punctuation, by default, you're going to close out your title with a period. Cool? Now to address the two categories, we already know that if it's a standalone source, we're going to italicize the title element. Great. If it's part of a greater whole, you're going to leave it in normal font. However, you're going to use a single quotation to surround the title, signifying that this element is part of a greater whole. But good news, we are officially at the last element, which is the source. And so I'm going to start by saying that the source element definitely has the most variation, because this is really when you need to pay attention to the type of source you're citing. So there are other categories, but I find if you learn what to do in these three situations, you can take this knowledge and apply it to anything you want. So we have printed sources, online sources, and periodicals. And a periodical is simply a source that's published in regular time intervals. So it's published periodically. But starting with the printed book, here's how you're going to format the source element. you want to include the city published, followed by a colon, and then the name of the publisher. Yes, they're going to be written out in title case because they're proper nouns. And so coming down here, for an example, you might have New York as the city published. You have that colon, and then let's say Routledge or Routledge is the publisher. I'm not sure what the pronunciation is there. Okay, now let's move on to an online source. Here is how you're going to format the source element to signify that, well, it's online. So you're going to start by typing out available at, then you're going to include a colon, in which you're going to include the URL link after. I want you to note, however, that the URL link is enclosed in angle brackets. Then, to finish this source element out, you're going to include the access date. So when did you look up this source? You're going to format that as accessed with a colon, followed by the day, month, year. So as you can see, that's exactly what we did here in this example. We have available at the URL link. Note that it is a live link, so someone can click it and look it up. It's surrounded in the angle brackets. And then finally, let's say we access this on the 9th of October, so that's how we format it. Note that there is no period after the second parenthesis. So when it's an online source, something like a web page, you only need to include the location of where to find it. You don't need to include, say, the name of the website, okay? Now, a periodical, on the other hand, this is a little different. This one definitely has the most moving parts. So first, a periodical, is this a standalone source or part of a greater whole? Well, since we can see that it's italicized, that's an indicator that it's part of a greater whole. And the logic is sound because remember, a periodical is something like a journal article, which belongs to a greater whole, a journal, or say a magazine article or a newspaper article. So that's why we have the name of the source and it's going to be italicized. So when it comes to the rest of the source element, you're simply going to include the periodical information, and then if it is found online, you'll include the DOI or URL link. So now by default, you always want to include the DOI if it's available. You're only going to include the URL if there is no DOI. And now let's say that there is no DOI and you have to use the URL, then you're simply going to use this formatting principle right here, and that's exactly how you're going to format it. So let's say in this example, pardon me, I'm taking out the DOI, replacing it with the URL. That's what my reference list entry would look like. So that's what I mean when concepts build on each other, and if you understand the formatting principle, you're good to go. But okay, when it comes to the periodical information, you want to include the volume number, followed by the issue number enclosed in parentheses to signify the difference. You're then going to use a comma to separate the next element, which is going to be the page range. You're going to use the abbreviation PP period to signify that it's the page range. And then, like I said, you have the DOI or the URL link. And now sometimes parts of the periodical information will not be included. If you run into that situation, simply omit that portion. So if there's no volume number, don't include it. If there's no issue number, don't need it. If there's no page range, same thing, simply omit it from the reference list entry. Make sense? Easy peasy. Man, that was good. I hope it was good for you too. As always, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, go down to the comment section, type it out there. I love reading and responding to you guys. Don't forget to download that PDF if you haven't already. And with that, I will see you in the next video where we're gonna take all this knowledge and go through building actual reference list entries using Harvard style. I'll see you there.